The first light of dawn stretches across the rooftops of ancient Rome, painting the city in golden hues. Smoke curls from early morning fires, and the distant hum of waking life begins to fill the streets. But listen closely. Can you hear the laughter of children echoing between the marble columns? Today, we're stepping back in time to uncover a world few ever think about, the daily life of a Roman child. What was it like to grow up in the heart of an empire that shaped history? Did they race through cobblestone streets playing games, or spend long hours hunched over scrolls in school? And what secrets did their toys and trinkets hold? Imagine being a child in Rome 2,000 years ago. Your day might start with a simple breakfast of bread and olives, but the adventures that followed were anything but ordinary. While their parents navigated the bustling markets or debated in the forum, Roman kids had their own hidden world, one of wooden swords, clay dolls, and whispered lessons in crowded classrooms. Some wore tiny versions of their father's togas, practicing speeches like future senators. Others dodged chores to sneak off to the riverbanks, where makeshift boats became vessels for epic battles. This wasn't just childhood, it was training for life in the most powerful civilization on Earth. But here's the twist, their lives weren't so different from ours. They squabbled with siblings, daydreamed during lessons, and invented games with whatever they could find. Yet every moment was steeped in the values of Rome: discipline, loyalty, and the unshakable belief in their destiny. So what can these children teach us about the empire's rise and fall? How did their playtime prepare them for the weight of adulthood in a world of gladiators and emperors? Stick around, because we're about to unravel the mysteries of their world, one fascinating detail at a time. From the toys they cherished to the harsh lessons they learned, this is the untold story of growing up Roman, and it's more surprising than you'd ever guess. The sound of a rooster crowing breaks the silence as sunlight spills through the small windows of the domus. In these cramped but lively homes, Roman children would wake not to the buzz of an alarm, but to the stirrings of the household, the clatter of pots from the kitchen, the muffled voices of parents and slaves beginning the day. Their beds, often simple wooden frames with straw mattresses, offered little luxury, but comfort wasn't the priority in a world that prized discipline from the earliest age. Before even tasting breakfast, the family would gather at the lararium, the small shrine tucked into a corner of the home. Here, beneath the watchful eyes of carved layers, the protective spirits of the household, children learned their first lessons in piety. They'd watch as their father poured wine or scattered grain as an offering, whispering prayers for the family's safety and prosperity. This wasn't just ritual, it was a daily reminder that even the youngest members of Rome were bound to something greater. The gods weren't distant figures in temples, they lived in the walls, the hearth, the very air of the home. Then came breakfast, a humble but hearty affair. A round loaf of bread, still warm from the communal oven, might be torn into chunks and dipped in olive oil, a handful of olives, a slice of salty cheese, perhaps a few dried figs. This was fuel for the day ahead. There were no sugary cereals or elaborate morning feasts. Roman kids ate what the land provided, often the same foods their ancestors had eaten centuries before. But don't mistake simplicity for scarcity. In a world where food tied families to their past and their gods, even a crust of bread carried meaning. While mothers oversaw the kitchen and younger siblings, older children might already be preparing for school or chores. Boys would practice wrapping their child-sized togas, fumbling with the folds until they mirrored their father's dignified drape. Girls might help grind grain or weave, their small hands learning skills they'd need as future matrons of their own households. Every action, from prayer to breaking bread, was a thread in the fabric of Roman life, woven tight with tradition, duty, and the quiet understanding that childhood was fleeting. The empire waited for no one, not even its smallest citizens. Now picture a young Roman boy stepping into the sunlight, his small frame draped in a simple tunica, the standard garment for children of all classes. This wasn't just clothing, it was a uniform of childhood. Made from undyed wool or linen, the knee-length tunic was practical for play and modest enough to reflect Roman values. Boys wore it belted at the waist, the fabric swinging freely as they darted through the streets. But look closer and you'd spot the real mark of his identity, a bulla, a small pouch strung around his neck. Inside this golden or leather locket lay charms or amulets believed to ward off evil spirits. For freeborn boys, the bulla was more than decoration. It was a badge of citizenship, worn until they traded childhood for the toga virilis in their mid-teens. Girls, meanwhile, mirrored their mothers in miniature. A young Roman girl might wear a tunica too, but as she grew, she'd layer it with a woolen stola, the long, sleeveless dress that signaled her respectability. Her hair, often parted in the center and tied back with ribbons or bands, reflected the family's status. Wealthier girls might adorn their braids with delicate gold hairnets, while simpler ties sufficed for others. But like her brothers, she wore a bulla, though hers often contained a crescent moon charm, symbolizing protection under Diana, the goddess of childbirth and youth. These weren't just fashion choices. Every thread and trinket told a story. The quality of the cloth revealed a family's wealth. The bulla's weight, whether hollow or solid gold, hinted at their standing. Even the colors mattered. While most children wore natural hues, the elite might flaunt stripes of purple or red, dyes so expensive they screamed privilege. And then there were the shoes, simple leather sandals for running errands, but ornate calfskin boots for special occasions, each sole marked with patterns to leave proud imprints in the dust. Art from the era brings these details to life. Frescoes in Pompeii show boys clutching wooden horses, their bully gleaming against bright tunics. Statues of young girls depict them holding dolls, their stolas draped in careful folds. Even graffiti scratched into walls reveals children at play, their clothing simplified but unmistakably Roman. These images remind us that childhood in antiquity wasn't so alien. Their outfits, like ours, blended practicality with identity, tradition with tiny rebellions. A scuffney poking through a tunic, a bulla tucked under a collar to avoid chores. These were the small acts of kids who, despite the weight of empire, still found ways to be young. For the sons of Rome's elite, education wasn't just about learning letters. It was the first battlefield in a lifelong war for status. The journey began with the literator, a teacher whose small, often crowded classroom echoed with the scratching of style on wax. Picture a room where sunlight filtered through shuttered windows, illuminating rows of boys hunched over wooden tablets filled with beeswax. With blunt styluses, they painstakingly carved Latin letters, erasing mistakes with the flat end and starting again. This was no gentle introduction. Discipline was harsh, and mistakes meant the sting of a switch or the humiliation of standing in the corner. But mastering the alphabet was only the first step. Next came copying moral maxims like labor omnia vincit, work conquers all, phrases designed to mold mind and character alike. By the age of 7, those who showed promise advanced to the grammaticus, a scholar who turned lessons into a gateway to power. Here, the focus shifted from simple writing to dissecting the great works: Homer's Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid, and the speeches of Cicero. Students didn't just read these texts, they tore them apart line by line, analyzing every metaphor and historical reference. A single passage might spark debates on ethics, politics, or the gods, training these boys to think like future senators. But the grammaticus wasn't just teaching literature, he was building a shared cultural language. When a wealthy Roman boy quoted Virgil in the Forum or referenced Odysseus in a speech, it wasn't just showing off, it proved he belonged to the class destined to rule. Wax tablets remained constant companions, but now they held complex exercises. A student might translate Greek poetry into Latin, then rework it into his own verses. Another could draft imaginary legal arguments, practicing the rhetorical flourishes that might one day sway a jury. And always there was memorization, endless recitations drilled into them until the words flowed as naturally as breath. The stakes were high. A clumsy translation or forgotten line didn't just mean embarrassment. It hinted at a family's declining standards. Fathers paid top wages for the finest tutors, and they expected results. Yet even in this rigid world, glimpses of childhood peek through. Archaeologists have found tablets scrawled with doodles, tiny gladiators battling in margins, caricatures of stern teachers. One particularly cheeky student in Roman Britain even wrote a curse tablet against his grammaticus, a secret rebellion pressed into lead and buried. These small acts remind us that behind the marble ideals of Roman education, real children still squirmed in their seats, dreamed of play, and occasionally, just occasionally, got away with mischief. While the sons of Rome's wealthy families debated poetry in sunlit classrooms, the children of cobblers, bakers, and laborers faced a very different education, one measured in calloused hands and long hours. For most Roman kids, formal schooling was an unthinkable luxury. Instead of wax tablets, they held tools. Rather than Homer's verses, they memorized the rhythms of their father's hammer or their mother's loom. Apprenticeship wasn't just training, it was survival. Picture a boy barely tall enough to peer over a blacksmith's anvil. By 6 or 7, he'd be hauling charcoal, pumping bellows, and fetching water to quench glowing metal. His lessons came in the blistering heat of the forge: how to judge iron by its color, when to strike for perfect tempering, which angles made a plow blade cut deep without snapping. Mistakes meant ruined goods or worse, a burned arm, a smashed finger, but each scar taught what no classroom could. By 12, he might be shaping nails or hinges. By 15, crafting swords for the very legionaries who patrolled the streets. Girls, meanwhile, learned domestic crafts with relentless precision. In cramped apartments or workshop corners, mothers and daughters spun wool side by side, their fingers flying as they turned fleece into yarn, yarn into cloth. Speed mattered. Textiles fed families, whether sold at market or woven into tunics for wealthier households. Some girls apprenticed in specialized trades, like dyeing fabrics with expensive Tyrian purple or crafting delicate gold thread for the elite. Every stitch was a calculation. Too slow and the family went hungry, too careless and their reputation, their lifeline crumbled. Even play mirrored this relentless practicality. A poor child's toys were often tools in miniature: tiny looms for weaving practice, wooden mallets for mimicking a carpenter's strikes. Archaeologists have unearthed dolls with removable cloth dresses, likely used to teach sewing. These weren't just playthings, they were the first steps toward a trade that would define their entire lives. The divide between rich and poor wasn't just about wealth, it was about time. Elite children spent years studying rhetoric because their families could afford the delay. For others, every unproductive hour meant lost wages. Yet in this hardscrabble world, there was pride. A well-made pot, a perfectly balanced axe, a tapestry without a single flaw. These were their marks of excellence, their silent rebuttal to the scrolls of the privileged. And sometimes, just sometimes, talent cracked open doors. A gifted apprentice might catch a wealthy patron's eye, earning a rare chance to rise beyond his birth. But for most, childhood ended as soon as their hands grew strong enough to work. The streets of Rome echoed with the laughter of children long before the first lesson began or the first chore was done. Buried beneath layers of volcanic ash in Pompeii, archaeologists have uncovered a treasure trove of toys that tell a story not just of play, but of preparation, where every game was a lesson in disguise. Take the humble wooden sword carved with care by a father's hand. To a modern eye, it might seem like a simple plaything, but for a Roman boy, it was his first taste of duty. He'd spar with friends, pretending to be a legionary defending the empire, unknowingly rehearsing for a future where military service wasn't just glory, but expectation. Girls, too, had their own tools of imagination, exquisitely crafted dolls, some with jointed limbs made of ivory or bone, have been found in the ruins of Pompeii's homes. These weren't just companions, they were miniature models of the women these girls would become. Dressed in tiny tunics and stolas, the dolls mirrored the rituals of Roman womanhood, weaving, managing households, even presiding over miniature religious ceremonies. A cracked doll's face or a frayed dress wasn't a tragedy, it was evidence of a childhood spent practicing for adulthood's responsibilities. Then there were the games that blurred the line between chance and skill. Astragali or knucklebones were a favorite, a set of 4 small bones from sheep or goats, used like dice. Children would toss them onto the ground, scoring points based on how they landed. But this wasn't just idle gambling, it sharpened quick thinking and calculation, skills vital in a society where trade and negotiation were daily necessities. Even hide and seek had its purpose. Navigating the labyrinthine alleys of Roman cities trained kids to memorize layouts, a survival skill in crowded urban life. Ball games, too, were far from frivolous. Frescoes showed children bouncing balls against walls or passing them in circles, their motion strikingly similar to modern handball. But for Romans, these games weren't just about coordination. They reinforced teamwork, rhythm, and the discipline of following rules, qualities that would serve them well in the militarized, highly structured world they'd inherit. Perhaps most telling are the traces left behind in unlikely places: a scratched hopscotch grid found in a Pompeian courtyard, its lines worn deep by countless jumps. A marble forgotten in the dust of a marketplace, its glassy surface still reflecting the sunlight that last touched it 2 millennia ago. These artifacts whisper a truth often lost in histories of empires and emperors. Roman children, for all their future burdens, still found moments to be nothing more than kids. Their games were rehearsals for life, yes, but also proof that joy in any era is universal. The sun climbed high over Rome as the morning's lessons and labor gave way to a brief but essential respite, prandium, the midday meal that fueled the rest of the day. Unlike the elaborate cena enjoyed in the evening, this was a utilitarian affair, often eaten standing up or perched on a bench with little ceremony. For the wealthy, it might mean cold meats from last night's feast, paired with olives, cheese, and a handful of figs, quick, nourishing bites between business in the forum or intellectual debates. A slave might bring water to wash hands, but there were no sprawling dining couches or lengthy toasts. Time was money, even for the elite. For the working classes, prandium was even simpler. A chunk of yesterday's bread, dipped in vinegar or crushed garlic to revive its flavor, might be the centerpiece. A few wrinkled grapes or a slice of onion added variety, and if the household was lucky, a smear of fish paste from a reused amphora. Street vendors hawked hot sausages or fried dough to those too busy to return home, their smoky aroma mingling with the dust of the streets. Children from poorer families often ate where they worked, apprentices gnawing on crusts beside their master's anvil, or market helpers swallowing bites between customers. There was no luxury of slowing down, yet even in this hurried meal, social divisions shone. A patrician's son might nibble honeyed walnuts while reviewing Greek vocabulary, his food served on bronze plates. Meanwhile, a farmer's child sitting on a sack of grain would crack open hard-boiled eggs with dirt still under their nails, the shells tossed to scrawny chickens pecking nearby. And for the enslaved, prandium was whatever could be scavenged scraps from the master's table, or a cold porridge gulped in the shadows of the kitchen. But here's what united them all, the understanding that food was fuel, not just pleasure. A Roman child learned early that meals were tied to rhythm, not indulgence. The rich ate swiftly to return to politics or study, the poor ate to sustain the sweat of their labor. Even the act of sharing a loaf, torn by hand, never cut reinforced community. In a city where time was measured by the sundial and the water clock, prandium was a pause, not a stop. The bread might differ, the wine might water down, but every bite carried the same unspoken lesson. The day wasn't done yet. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city, Roman children traded games and lessons for the unglamorous but vital work that kept households running. Think of a boy no taller than a donkey's flank, balancing an amphora on his shoulder as he shuffled toward the public fountain. Water duty was a near-universal chore, heavy, endless, and utterly essential. Every trip to the fountain or well-taught endurance, balancing, and the quiet pride of contributing. For wealthier families, slaves might handle this task, but in most homes, even young children carried their share, their arms growing stronger with each dripping journey back. Boys followed their fathers like shadows, absorbing trades through observation and muscle memory. A fisherman's son untangled nets before he could properly tie his sandals, his small fingers learning to repair frayed threads. In market stalls, budding merchants calculated prices with pebbles before they could write numbers, their education unfolding not on wax tablets, but in the clatter of coins. Even the elite weren't exempt. Patrician boys trailed their fathers to the forum, where they memorized the art of negotiation by watching deals sealed with a handshake. These weren't just chores, they were apprenticeships in citizenship, where every task carried whispers of future roles as providers and patriarchs. Girls, meanwhile, transformed kitchens into classrooms. A mother's sharp-eyed supervision turned bread, making into a lesson in chemistry, knowing, when the yeast was lively enough, how the oven's heat might vary with the day's wind. Spinning wool wasn't just a chore, it was economics. A well-spun thread meant extra cloth to sell, and girls learned to judge quality by touch, their fingertips detecting imperfections invisible to untrained eyes. In wealthier homes, young mistresses practiced directing enslaved workers, their voices finding the tricky balance between authority and grace. Rural life demanded even more. On farms, children became miniature laborers, scattering seed behind a plow, shooing birds from newly planted fields, or gathering fallen olives before the first frost. A girl might tend the kitchen garden, learning which herbs cured headaches and which could spoil a stew. Boys repaired fences with hands still soft, their blisters a rite of passage. Gender roles blurred in the countryside. When harvest demanded it, everyone worked until their backs ached and the light faded, yet hidden in these duties were small rebellions. A boy might accidentally spill a bucket to buy time at the fountain, where friends gathered. A girl could trade a perfectly woven band for a handful of hazelnuts, bargaining like the merchant she'd never be allowed to become. Roman childhood was a tightrope walk between duty and desire, tradition and the irrepressible urge to carve out moments of freedom. Every chore, no matter how mundane, was a stitch in the fabric of their future. But if you look closely at the frescoes and letters left behind, you'll spot the truth. Even under empire's weight, children still found ways to be children. Beyond the watchful eyes of parents and teachers, Rome streets and alleyways hummed with the secret society of childhood, a world where friendships were forged in the chaos of play and the quiet corners of public spaces. Picture the bustling baths, not just as places of cleanliness, but as grand social hubs where children dodged bathers to splash in shallow pools, their laughter bouncing off marble walls. Here class lines blurred momentarily. A senator's son might challenge a baker's boy to a game of nuts, tossing polished hazelnuts into carved circles in the stone floor. Even the graffiti etched into Pompeii's walls tells this story. Crude drawings of stick-figure gladiators duel beside scrawled names, immortalizing friendships like Marcus loves Lucilla or Sextus was here. These weren't just idle marks, they were declarations of belonging, etched defiantly where adults couldn't erase them. Games became the glue of these bonds. A cluster of boys might reenact the latest chariot race using broken pottery as horses, their voices rising in mock commentary like the roar of the Circus Maximus crowd. Girls gathered in shaded porticos, whispering over dolls made of rags or casting knucklebones for fortunes, their alliances shifting like the shadows. And woe betide the outsider who disrupted the rhythm. Cliques guarded their traditions fiercely, with rules passed down not by adults but by older siblings or the legendary big kids of the neighborhood. Yet friendship wasn't all innocence. Graffiti from Herculaneum reveals taunts and inside jokes, proving that Roman kids could be as merciless as they were loyal. A poorly drawn caricature of a strict teacher, a cheeky rhyme about a classmate's big ears, these were the ancient equivalent of passing notes in class. And just like today, hierarchies emerged, the fastest runner, the best storyteller, the one whose father brought treats from the market. But in a society where adulthood came early, these fleeting moments of camaraderie were lifelines. When a friend moved away or was sent to apprentice in another city, the parting was bittersweet, marked by exchanged trinkets or a shared meal stolen from the pantry, tiny rebellions against the inevitable. The true magic lay in the unspoken understanding that these streets, these games, this brief window of freedom was theirs alone. While adults fretted over politics and trade, children turned cobblestones into kingdoms and bathhouse echoes into secret languages. The empire would claim them soon enough, but for now they were just kids, writing their names on the world in chalk and laughter. Among the marble floors and frescoed walls of Roman homes, another kind of treasure often padded on silent paws, beloved pets who share the daily lives of children. Archaeologists have uncovered delicate gold-bird skeletons still resting in tiny cages, their owners long gone but their presence preserved by time. Dogs curl at the feet of children in mosaics, their names forever etched in stone collars. My name is Issa, reads one from Pompeii. I am the little dog of Publius. These weren't just animals, they were confidants, playmates, even status symbols in a world where companionship crossed species. Wealthy children might wake to the chatter of a caged songbird or the antics of a pet monkey imported from distant lands. Exotic creatures like green parrots from India or African cheetahs kept on leashes by the elite were living proof of Rome's far-reaching power. But for most families, simpler companions reigned. Dogs, especially small breeds like the Melite, were constant shadows. Tombstones depict them leaping into children's arms or lying faithfully under their dining couches. Some inscriptions mourned their loss with startling tenderness. To Helena, foster child, reads one epitaph for a dog, incomparable and deserving of praise. Even working animals blur the line between utility and affection. A shepherd's son might name his shaggy guardian dog and sneak at scraps despite his father's scolding. City kids befriended the alley cats that kept granaries free of mice, though Romans saw felines more as pest control than cuddly pets. But birds, birds were different. Finches and nightingales kept in wicker cages were prized for their songs. Wealthy boys trained magpies to mimic speech, while girls adorned their pet doves with ribbons, treating them like feathered dolls. Art captures these bonds in vivid detail. A mosaic from Ostia shows a boy giggling as his puppy tugs at his sandal strap. A fresco in Herculaneum freezes a moment of mischief. A monkey, perhaps a merchant's exotic gift, snatching fruit from a toddler's hand as a dog barks below. Even the humblest homes yielded clay figurines of animals, crudely made but clearly cherished, their worn snouts and wings smoothed by years of childish caresses. Yet pets were more than just toys. They taught responsibility, feeding, training, cleaning cages, and softened the harsh edges of a world where children matured fast. A sick puppy might be a boy's first encounter with loss. A bird's broken wing could spark a future veterinarian. And in a society where fathers were often distant figures and marriages were political arrangements, the unconditional love of a scrappy terrier or a loyal dove might have been a child's purest friendship. The Romans, for all their famed stoicism, left behind one undeniable truth: the heart of a child has always beat the same, whether curled around a purring cat or whispering secrets to a feathered friend 2,000 years ago. The scent of burning incense curled through the air as a young girl stood on tiptoe to place a garland of flowers at the feet of the household lararium. Religion wasn't just something Romans practiced, it lived in their bones from the moment they could walk. For children, faith wasn't abstract sermons or distant temple ceremonies. It was the tangible rhythm of daily life. Every meal began with a pinch of salt tossed into the fire for Vesta. Every threshold crossed invoked Janus. Even bedtime whispered with prayers to Somnus, the god of sleep. Take Saturnalia, Rome's raucous December festival where social norms flipped upside down. Children normally deferential to parents suddenly saw their fathers serving them at the table, masters waiting on slaves, and classrooms shuttered for a week of mischief. Boys and girls crowned with felt caps, symbols of freed slaves, raced through streets gorging on honey treats, while families gambled with dice normally forbidden. But beneath the chaos lay serious purpose. These reversals taught that order and disorder were two sides of the same coin. A child stuffing his face with figs while his stern tutor pretended to obey him wasn't just having fun. He was learning that even rigid hierarchies needed occasional release valves. Smaller rituals shaped ordinary days too. Before exams, students left styluses and tablets at Mercury's shrine, hoping for divine assistance in their studies. Girls reaching marriageable age dedicated their childhood dolls to Venus or Diana, marking the transition to adulthood. Even toys had sacred dimensions. Archaeologists have found spinning tops inscribed with gods' names, turning play into inadvertent worship. The most poignant evidence comes from tiny offerings preserved by time: a child's clay handprint pressed into a votive figurine, a crudely written prayer to Jupiter scrawled on a shard of pottery. These weren't assignments from stern parents, but spontaneous acts of devotion, or sometimes desperate bargaining. A sick puppy might prompt a handful of grain spilled before lairs. A stolen sweet could inspire hasty apologies to the family's guardian spirits. Yet religion wasn't all solemnity. Frescoes show boys giggling as they lead decorated goats to sacrifice, their faces alight with excitement rather than fear. Tombstones depict girls dancing in temple processions, their flower crowns bobbing as musicians played. Even misfortune carried lessons. When a prize chicken chosen for sacrifice escaped, the ensuing chase became both comedy and reminder that gods demanded earnest effort, not perfection. This was the paradox of Roman childhood faith. It bound them to tradition while leaving room for wonder. They learned that gods governed everything from thunderstorms to toothaches, yet also that deities could be bargained with, cajoled, even teased during rowdy festivals. By the time they donned adult robes, religion wasn't rules to memorize. It was the language they'd breathed since taking their first steps beneath the watchful eyes of carved household gods. The forum hummed like a beehive as a young Roman boy darted between the stalls, his fingers brushing against baskets of plump figs and amphories sloshing with garum, the pungent fish sauce that flavored half of Rome's dishes. Markets weren't just places to shop, they were theaters of commerce, where children absorbed the empire's vastness through scent, sound, and spectacle. Pliny the Elder wrote of stalls groaning under Indian pepper, African ivory, and Spanish olive oil, a sensory map of conquest and trade routes. For a child, it was pure magic. One booth displayed silks so fine they floated like clouds, while the next offered live peacocks, their iridescent tails dragging through the dust as wealthy matrons haggled over prices. Street performers turned corners into stages. A fire eater might send a burst of flame skyward, drawing gasps and scattering pigeons, while an acrobat balanced on a rope stretched between two columns. But the real stars were the storytellers, crowds of children perched on the edges of fountains, mouths agape as a raconteur spun tales of Hercules' labors or the founding of Rome, his voice dropping to a whisper for the ghostly scenes. Coins clinked at his feet, some tossed by parents grateful for a moment's peace to bargain over wool or wine. Food stalls were danger zones for sticky fingers. A mischievous girl might accidentally bump a table, snatching a honey cake while the vendor scolded her fleeing tunic. More cautious kids lingered near bakeries, hoping for a misshapen loaf tossed to the crowd still warm, its crust crackling between their teeth. Meanwhile, butcher stalls taught hasty lessons in biology. Severed boar heads grinned from hooks, their tusks a warning to steer clear unless sent by mother with exact coins for a pound of lamb. For wealthy children, the market was a classroom. A senator's son might trail his father past merchants' tables, listening as deals were struck with handshakes and promises sworn by Jupiter's name. They'd pause at the banker's bench where abacus beads clicked like crickets, calculating interest rates on loans. Even the graffiti here was educational crude tallies of debts owed, or advertisements for gladiator games scrawled in charcoal. But the market's greatest lesson was diversity. Syrian merchants in embroidered tunics sold spices that stung the nose, while Gallic traders demonstrated iron tools with hands scarred by forge burns. A Greek physician's stall might display jars of leeches, beside Egyptian perfumers wafting lotus-scented oils. To young Romans, these encounters whispered a truth no scroll could teach. Their empire was a patchwork of cultures, all funneled into this cacophony of barter and banter. By sunset, as vendors shuttered their stalls and stray cats prowled for scraps, children carried home more than parcels. They carried stories, flavors, and the unshakable sense that Rome was the world's beating heart. In the cool shade of a Paris-style garden, a young girl's fingers fumble across the strings of a lyre, its wooden frame worn smooth by countless practice sessions. Music wasn't just entertainment in ancient Rome. It was a language of status, culture, and even politics, and children learned its alphabet early. Archaeologists have unearthed child-sized instruments across the empire, from tiny flutes no longer than a handspan to miniature citharas with strings tuned for small hands. These weren't toys, they were tools of socialization, as essential to a patrician's education as rhetoric or philosophy. A well-played lyre could charm guests at a dinner party, while flute skills might secure a place in religious processions. Even emperors weren't exempt. Nero famously practiced the cithara obsessively, his childhood tutors drilling him until his fingers bled, proof that musical prowess was power. But music wasn't confined to the elite. Walk through the streets of Pompeii and you'd hear the sharp trill of bone flutes from open windows, where tradesmen's children practiced scales between chores. Taverns echo with the rhythmic clatter of children keeping time on oyster shells or wooden clappers, learning rhythm through play. Army forts yielded brass whistles shaped like birds, part toy, part training tool for future soldiers who'd use similar instruments to relay battlefield commands. The message was clear: whether destined for the Senate or the barracks, every Roman child was expected to understand music's grammar. Visual arts flourished in equally unexpected ways. Wax tablets from Roman Britain revealed clumsy alphabet exercises beside surprisingly skilled sketches of horses and gladiators, doodles that prove even stern teachers tolerated creativity. Wealthy children practiced painting on reusable ivory tablets, their pigments mixed from crushed minerals by enslaved tutors. But some of the most touching artifacts are humbler. A potsherd from Egypt bears a child's crude drawing of a sailing ship, its lines wobbly but eager. Another shows a stick figure family holding hands beneath a crescent moon, a snapshot of childhood imagination preserved in clay. Theatrical training blurred the lines between art and discipline. Boys rehearsed scenes from comedies in school, their voices trained to project across courtyards without shouting, a skill as useful in the forum as on stage. Girls learned expressive gestures by mimicking statuary, their movements becoming as precise as poetry. Even puppetry had its place. Articulated clay dolls with movable limbs may have been used to act out myths, turning bedtime stories into performances. Yet the true magic lay in how these arts intertwined. A fresco from Herculaneum shows a girl singing while her friend accompanies her on a tambourine, their heads tilted together in harmony. A mosaic in Ostia captures a boy mid-dance, his lyre slung across his back as he leaps over a line of seashells. These weren't just pastimes, they were rehearsals for adulthood's grander stages, where music would grace weddings, art would adorn tombs, and every citizen was expected to contribute to Rome's cultural tapestry. The instruments may be silent now, the paint's faded, but the legacy of these children's creativity still echoes down the centuries. When a Roman child's fever spiked or a cough rattled through the night, parents turned to remedies steeped in equal parts science and superstition. Galen, the empire's most famed physician, wrote detailed treatises on pediatric care, yet his advice often sat alongside charms whispered by grandmothers. Take teething, a universal ordeal met with a startling mix of practicality and magic. Mothers might rub a baby's gums with hare's brain paste, a remedy Galen endorsed for its numbing properties, while also tying amber amulets around tiny necks to ward off evil spirits. Archaeologists have found these beads strung on linen threads, their surfaces worn smooth by anxious kisses and tiny fingers. Herbal lore dominated household medicine. A scraped knee might be smeared with honey, its antibacterial properties well understood, while chamomile soothed colicky infants, but the line between pharmacy and faith blurred fast. A child suffering from nightmares might drink poppy syrup under a physician's orders, or sleep with a pouch of dried so's udder beneath the pillow, a folk cure scribbled in the margins of medical scrolls. Even the wealthy, who could afford Greek-trained doctors, kept home shrines stocked with votive offerings shaped like swollen bellies or aching ears, just in case the gods needed persuading. Disease lurked everywhere. Gravestones tell heartbreaking stories. Lucius, aged 5, taken by fever, or Claudia, who laughed for 2 summers. Roman cities, for all their aqueducts, were breeding grounds for parasites and infections. Children playing in forums touched coins crusted with germs, then sucked their thumbs. Crowded apartments spread tuberculosis like gossip, and despite Galen's meticulous notes on diagnosing illness by pulse and urine, his best advice for plague was to flee quickly, a luxury few had. Yet resilience flourished in unexpected ways. Wet nurses were rigorously vetted, contracts from Pompeii specified their diet and hygiene, schools closed during outbreaks, and toys were washed in vinegar. Parents concocted tonics from pomegranate and myrrh, their recipes passed down like heirlooms, and when all else failed, there was always prayer. A child's illness wasn't just a bodily crisis, it was a test of piety, a moment when scalpel and incantation held equal weight. The scalpels have rusted, the amulets faded, but the fear and hope they carried still feels hauntingly familiar. The crack of a wooden rod against a desk sent shivers through the classroom, a sound every Roman child knew meant trouble. Discipline wasn't just a lesson, it was a visceral experience carved into flesh and memory. The ferula, a stout cane of birch or willow, hung ominously near the teacher's lectern, its presence as much a part of the classroom as wax tablets and scrolls. A boy caught daydreaming might extend his palm, enduring stinging strikes until his fingers trembled too much to hold his stylus. For graver offenses, talking back, cheating, or worse, damaging precious scrolls, the punishment escalated to bare backs whipped across the bench, the welts a brutal reminder that Roman education prized obedience above all. Even the children of senators weren't exempt. Cicero's letters mention his own son's beatings, proof that status didn't spare the rod, yet not all Romans agreed with such severity. Seneca the Younger, the famed Stoic philosopher, argued that education should inspire rather than terrorize. The mind is not a vessel to be filled, but a fire to be kindled, he wrote, scolding parents and teachers who confused brutality with rigor. He recounted tales of exemplary tutors who used praise and patience, turning reluctant students into eager scholars. In one letter, he describes a child gently corrected for mispronouncing a word, not with blows, but with a playful comparison to birdsong, transforming the mistake into a moment of connection. Seneca's voice was a rare one in a culture that saw pain as a purifying force, but his ideas hinted at a quieter truth. Fear might enforce compliance, but it rarely nurtured curiosity. The contradiction played out in homes as much as schools. Fathers wielded the vitus, a vine-wood staff symbolizing their absolute authority, while mothers balanced discipline with softer tools like shame or bribery. Anecdotes survive of boys forced to wear wooden signs detailing their misdeeds around their necks, their cheeks burning under the stares of neighbors. Girls might be confined to spinning wool in silence, their looms clicking like metronomes marking their penitence. Even toys became instruments of control, a misbehaving child's doll or wooden sword confiscated until atonement was made. Archaeology offers haunting evidence of these practices. A child's wax tablet found in Britain bears not just grammar exercises, but also a desperate plea scratched beneath the words, "Please don't beat me." Another shows a crude drawing of a teacher raising his rod, flanked by tears drawn in shaky lines, yet for all the brutality, there were flashes of tenderness. Tombstones sometimes depict parents embracing their children, their inscriptions mourning lives cut short by illness, not punishment, and in the quiet corners of villas, frescoes show mothers bending to wipe away tears, their hands gentle on flushed cheeks. The debate over discipline mirrored Rome's broader tensions between tradition and progress. Was pain the price of greatness, as old Cato insisted when he taught his son to endure cold and hunger without complaint? Or could wisdom flourish without wounds, as Seneca dared to hope? The empire never fully answered the question, but in the scars, both physical and invisible, left on generations of children, we see the cost of a system that worshipped strength, yet sometimes forgot the fragility of the minds it shaped. The triclinium lamps flickered as slaves carried in the third course roasted thrushes stuffed with figs, their tiny legs crisp to perfection. At the far end of the dining couch, 9-year-old Lucius sat stiffly in his best tunic, torn between awe and boredom as his father's guests debated Virgil. Roman dinner parties were adult affairs, but children like Lucius weren't always banished entirely. Elite families saw these evenings as living classrooms, where sons might be summoned to recite Horace or demonstrate their Greek pronunciation for applauding guests. A flawless performance earned nods of approval. A stuttered line meant burning cheeks and his father's quiet frown later. Girls faced subtler expectations. Little Cornelia might present honey cakes to visitors, her head bowed just so, while matrons sized up her posture and poise. Some hosts even staged miniature symposiums for children in adjoining rooms, where they practiced debating fables or sang hymns to Apollo, their laughter drifting in between courses, a reminder that Rome's future leaders were being groomed between sips of watered wine. But the real lessons came in observation. Children perched like silent owls, absorbing how alliances were forged over spiced wine, how a well-timed joke could deflect political tension. They learned that dining couches were battlefields where reputations rose and fell, one guest quoting Homer to prove a point, another crumbling bread to avoid answering a loaded question. Even the seating held meaning. The host's son noted who got the prime spot near the incense burner and who was relegated near the drafty doorway, yet childhood still peeked through the formality. Archaeologists have found children's graffiti beneath triclinium frescoes, tiny ships scratched into plaster during long speeches. Slave children tasked with refilling cups might sneak each other olives under the table, while a younger sibling dozed against a nurse's shoulder, his head lolling as the dessert tray circulated. By the fourth hour, most children were whisked away, their beds calling as the adults' conversations turned to scandal or war. What survived was the unspoken curriculum. That power wasn't just seized in Senate halls, but cemented over Mulsum wine and peacock brains. The children who mastered both poetry and patience at these meals would one day host their own, carrying forward traditions as timeless as the olive pits swept from the mosaic floors. The oil lamp cast flickering shadows on the ceiling as little Marcus curled closer to his nutrix, her voice weaving tales older than the 7 hills themselves. Bedtime in Rome was more than just rest. It was the hour when mythology came alive through the whispers of caretakers, blending entertainment with education. Nurses, often Greek slaves prized for their storytelling, didn't merely recite fables, they performed them with hushed theatrics, their hands shaping wolves and rivers in the dim light. Aesop's cunning foxes and persevering tortoises weren't just animals, they were mirrors held up to childish behavior, teaching that brains trumped brawn and patience outlasted haste. Take the ubiquitous tale of Romulus and Remus, as the Nutrix described the twins' miraculous survival, suckled by a she-wolf, raised by a shepherd, she'd pause dramatically before the fratricidal climax. And so Romulus lifted his spade. Her trailing silence said more than any moralizing lecture. Ambition unchecked could destroy even brotherhood. The story wasn't just foundation myth, it was a cautionary lesson about loyalty and the perils of unchecked power, absorbed night after night like mother's milk. Fables tailored to a child's world made abstract virtues tangible. A lazy boy might hear of the ant and grasshopper, his fingers tightening on the blanket as he imagined winter's hunger. A gritty sibling squirmed at the goose that laid golden eggs, its disembowelment by impatient hands forever linking rashness to loss. Even humor had purpose. The donkey in lion's skin, unmasked by a bray, taught that pretense couldn't outlast reality. These weren't passive stories. Nurses encouraged children to act them out with cloth puppets or carved figures, turning lessons into lived experience. The oral tradition held special power in a society where many still learn through listening rather than reading. Aesop's terse phrases, "slow and steady wins the race," lodged in young minds, ready to surface years later during military drills or business negotiations. But the myths also served as subtle propaganda. Tales of Horatius defending the bridge single-handedly, or Mucius Scaevola burning his own hand to ash modeled Roman virtues: bravery, sacrifice, unwavering resolve. By the time a child could recite these stories by heart, they'd internalized the empire's ideal citizen. Archaeology hints at how deeply these tales resonated. A ceramic lamp from Ostia shows a nutrix whispering to a child, their faces illuminated by its flame. Dollhouses found in Pompeii include tiny figures of wolves and shepherds, suggesting children reenacted myths with their toys. Even graffiti preserves snippets: a crude drawing of the Trojan horse on a schoolroom wall, its belly crammed with stick figure Greeks, yet the stories weren't monoliths. Greek nurses might slip in tales of Odysseus' cunning alongside Roman stoicism, their dual loyalties creating cultural bridges. Syrians or Egyptians in the household added their own lore: Anubis judging souls or Isis healing the sick, quietly expanding young minds to an empire far wider than Italy. The best nutrices knew when to adapt, softening gruesome endings for sensitive listeners or inventing new adventures for familiar characters. As the lamp burned low and the child's eyelids drooped, the stories didn't end, they seeped into dreams. Tomorrow's play might feature a makeshift Palatine Hill built of pillows or a stuffed wolf rescuing doll twins from an upturned basket. Rome's myths were never just stories, they were the blueprint of a shared identity, passed one whispered tale at a time. Beyond Rome's crowded streets, the rhythms of childhood pulsed to a different beat, one set by the turning of seasons and the sweat of labor in the fields. While city boys memorized Virgil's verses about farming, rural children lived them, their small hands calloused from gripping plow handles before they could properly write their names. The poets Georgics praised the happy life of shepherds, but reality was harsher. A 5-year-old scattering seed behind an ox-drawn plow knew hunger wasn't just a metaphor when hail ruined the crop. Farms demanded everyone's labor. At dawn, girls as young as 6 balanced baskets of eggs on their heads, their bare feet avoiding duck ponds where geese hissed at intruders. Boys trailed fathers to olive groves, learning to judge fruit ripeness by the purple blush on its skin. Even toddlers had roles chasing birds from newly sown fields with clattering sticks, or gathering fallen grapes during harvest, their fingers sticky with juice that attracted clouds of bees. The countryside offered no tutors or wax tablets, but its lessons were relentless. A missed milking meant no cheese for market. A poorly mended fence invited wolves to the sheepfold. Yet freedom flourished in unexpected ways. Where urban children dodged carts in narrow alleys, rural kids raced to orchards with wolfhounds at their heels. They learned the land's secrets: which hollow trees housed honeycombs, where streams hid crayfish under flat stones. Hunting wasn't sport but survival. A 12-year-old with a sling could keep the family pot simmering with hares or partridges. Winter brought its own rhythms, mending tools by the hearth, twisting rope from flax, and listening to grandfathers recount how the stars foretold planting times long before calendars existed. Virgil's idealized bees in their waxen fortress had real-life counterparts: children prizing honeycombs from hives while smoke curled around their faces, or grinding herbs to soothe the stings they inevitably suffered. His verses about pruning vines mirrored the seasonal agony of watching spring frosts blacken tender shoots after months of care. Rural childhood was a crash course in consequence where every action or inaction rippled through the family's survival. But it wasn't all toil. Folk songs replaced urban gossip, their melodies rising during grape harvests as children stomped barefoot in crushing vats. Festivals like the Perilia, where shepherds leapt over bonfires to purify flocks, turned work into revelry. And when the grind paused, there were swimming holes shaded by willows or makeshift chariots made of old barrels pulled by temperamental goats. The divide between city and country wasn't absolute. Wealthy landowners sent sons to inspect estates where they gaped at the callous hands of peasant boys their own age. Meanwhile, rural children bartered wool or cheese in town markets, wide-eyed at the marble temples and bustling schools they'd never attend. Both worlds shaped Rome, one through the sweat that fed it, the other through the politics that ruled it. Yet in the quiet of dusk, when fireflies winked over wheat fields and farmers' children collapsed onto straw pallets, the empire felt less like an abstract concept and more like the soil beneath their nails, inescapable, elemental, and alive. The day finally arrived when a Roman boy stood before his family's lararium, hands trembling as he untied the bulla from around his neck, the leather or gold amulet that had shielded him since infancy. This was Liberalia, the March festival where boys on the cusp of manhood traded childhood symbols for the stark white toga virilis, its heavy folds whispering of civic duty and legal responsibility. The ceremony was as much public spectacle as private milestone. Fathers paraded their sons through the forum, stopping at temples to offer locks of the boy's hair to the gods. At the temple of Liber, the patron of coming-of-age rites, wine flowed freely not just for celebration, but as a pointed lesson. The first sips taught these young men that intoxication, like freedom, required moderation. Meanwhile, the discarded bully weren't tossed aside carelessly. They were consecrated at household shrines, tangible reminders that the protection of childhood gods would soon be replaced by the far weightier armor of Roman virtue. For girls, the journey to adulthood lacked such fanfare but carried equal gravity. There was no single festival marking their transition, instead, a series of quiet preparations. Around puberty, a girl would dedicate her childhood dolls to Venus or Diana, laying them at temple altars as offerings. This wasn't mere plaything disposal, it signaled her readiness for marriage, often just years away. Elite families staged subtle displays of their daughter's eligibility. A girl might appear at banquets in her first stola, its draping modest yet unmistakably adult, or recite poetry to showcase her education. The ultimate rite unfolded on her wedding day when she'd part her hair with a ceremonial spearhead, a nod to Rome's martial roots, before donning the flame-colored veil that would shroud her face during vows. Behind these rituals lurked stark realities. A boy's toga ceremony coincided with his registration in the census as a taxpayer and potential soldier. One day he was reciting Horace in school, the next he could be called to vote in the comitia or hand a sword for legionary training. Girls faced an even sharper pivot. Their dolls might be replaced by real infants before they turned 18, their lives suddenly measured by childbirth counts and household management. The disparity wasn't lost on ancient observers. The poet Ovid, ever the provocateur, quipped that boys got festivals while girls changed their garments in silence, a jab at Rome's gendered double standard. Yet archaeology reveals nuances the texts omit. Some girls' bulli have been found buried with them, suggesting not all relinquished childhood's tokens willingly. Tombstones of young women sometimes depict them holding dolls, their inscriptions hinting at lives cut short before full adulthood. Boys, too, left traces of resistance. Graffiti in Pompeii's barracks shows new soldiers sketching childhood games alongside marching drills, their stylus lines wavering between nostalgia and duty. The true weight of these rites emerges in their contradictions. Rome celebrated boys' ascension to citizenship with public wine and speeches, yet their first legal act was often witnessing their father's will, a reminder that true independence might wait decades until paternal death. Girls traded dolls for distaffs, but the finest epitaphs praised them not just as wives and mothers, but as shrewd businesswomen who managed estates or funded temples. Coming of age in Rome wasn't a single moment. It was the first step onto a tightrope strung between personal ambition and societal expectation, where every misstep echoed across generations. The toga and the veil were costumes in the theater of empire, and beneath their folds, real children took their first trembling breaths as adults. In the shadow of Rome's marble grandeur, enslaved children woke not to lessons or play, but to the clank of chains and the crack of overseers' whips. While freeborn boys practiced rhetoric and girls wove wool under their mothers' watchful eyes, these young souls bore burdens that would break grown men. The mines of Spain and Sardinia swallowed them whole, tunnels so narrow they crawled on blistered knees, their lungs filling with dust as they chiseled silver from rock by the dim light of sputtering oil lamps. Archaeologists have found the tiny skeletons, their bones stunted from malnutrition but arms grotesquely muscular from endless hauling. One child's remains in Cartagena still clutched a rusted pickaxe, his fingers fused around it in death as in life. Domestic slavery offered no reprieve. A 7-year-old from Gaul might be tasked with holding a silver tray for hours without spilling a drop of wine, his legs trembling under the weight of expectation. Greek tutors wrote of children falling asleep mid-lesson, their faces smeared with ink from collapsed exhaustion. Wealthy households prized small hands for delicate work, threading pearls for matrons' necklaces or plucking stray hairs with tweezers during lengthy banquets. The poet Martial joked about a slave boy so nimble he could catch flies midair, but the reality was brutal precision enforced by Burns or Brands. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, raged against this system in letters that still sting with outrage. He described visiting a wealthy friend's villa where enslaved children stood like statues, trained not to blink or scratch despite swarming insects. When we say that one's a mere child, he wrote, we forget that though his body is small, his soul is as whole as any man's. His words were radical for an era when slave collars openly proclaimed, if I escape, return me to my master. Yet even Seneca's compassion had limits. He freed some slaves but kept others, a contradiction that mirrored Rome's uneasy conscience. The law offered no protection. A child born into slavery inherited their mother's status with no more rights than a chair or cooking pot. Bills of sale from Pompeii list prices for a young Cappadocian male approx 10 years, alongside livestock and sacks of grain. Some masters noted dental health not out of concern, but because toothless slaves fetched lower prices, yet glimmers of resistance surface in the archaeological record. A wooden doll hidden beneath the floorboards of a Pompeian kitchen, likely a secret comfort for a child taken from her parents. Graffiti in a latrine shows crude drawings of a stick figure boy kicking his master, a fleeting fantasy of rebellion. And occasionally, heartbreakingly, tombstones erected by fellow slaves, to Follicula, age 8, who loved birds and died far from home. These fragments whisper what official histories omit, that even in darkness, childhood's light couldn't be entirely extinguished. Rome built its glory on their small, broken backs, but their stories, long buried, now demand to be heard. The air crackled with laughter and the scent of roasting goat meat as young Marcus darted through the crowded street, his bare feet slapping against cobblestones slick with sacrificial blood. Lupercalia had arrived, the raucous February festival where Rome's wildest traditions upended the social order, and children became central players in rituals older than the Republic itself. Near the Palatine Hill, priests smeared in goat's blood sliced the hides into strips, handing them to teenage Luperci runners who charged through the city, playfully lashing women with the thongs to ensure fertility. But for boys like Marcus, the real prize lay in scrambling for discarded scraps of skin. Gripping the bloody strips meant good fortune, and competition turned fierce. Elbows flew as children ducked between senators' legs or scaled fountain edges to snatch the lucky tokens, their hands stained crimson as they waved trophies at jealous friends. Floralia in April offered gentler delights as the city erupted in blossoms. Girls wove crowns of violets and poppies, then tossed them into the Tiber as offerings to Flora, goddess of spring. The streets became impromptu stages where children reenacted myths with flower petals, scattering saffron to mark Apollo's path or arranging daisies into Persephone's crown before Hades' chariot, a wagon pulled by the neighborhood dogs, dragged her to the underworld. Even the games held hidden lessons. Balancing eggs on spoons taught patience, while flower-strewing races required careful strides to avoid crushing fragile blooms. Saturnalia in December flipped childhood's rules entirely. For one glorious week, masters served slaves, parents obeyed children's whims, and schoolrooms stood empty. Boys appointed themselves king for a day, issuing absurd decrees like demanding honey cakes for breakfast or canceling bedtime. The poet Marshall wrote of a child commanding his stern father to recite silly poems while wearing a clown's hat, an unthinkable act any other time of year. Yet beneath the chaos lay ancient wisdom. These reversals taught that hierarchy required consent, and even emperors owed their power to tradition's fragile thread. The Vestalia in June brought solemnity. Girls in white tunics carried baskets of sacred grain to Vesta's temple, their tiny feet tracing the same steps priestesses had walked for centuries. They ground flour with miniature pestles, baked holy cakes, and learned that fire, like childhood, required constant tending. A single lapse could extinguish the eternal flame, just as negligence might smother virtue. Archaeology preserves these fleeting joys. A child's wooden doll buried in Ostia wears a floral crown, perhaps a Floralia keepsake. A pottery shard from Britannia bears a crude carving of goat-legged luperci, scratched by some young observer captivated by the chaos. These fragments remind us that Roman festivals weren't just adult spectacles, they were invitations for children to touch the divine, to laugh at authority, and to weave their own stories into the grand tapestry of empire. The blood washed away, the petals withered, but the memories lingered, not just as nostalgia, but as proof that even in the rigid world of Rome, childhood had its sacred, rebellious seasons. Beneath the roar of the real Colosseum crowds, a quieter but no less passionate obsession thrived. The children of Rome, their imaginations ablaze with gladiator mania. Every market stall sold clay figurines of famed fighters, their tiny fists gripping miniature swords and nets, ready for epic kitchen table battles. Archaeologists have unearthed these figures by the hundreds, their painted details still vibrant, a Thracian's curved dagger or Retiarius trident, even the fearsome helmets with their towering crests. These weren't mere toys, they were portals to glory, letting boys and girls alike step into the sandals of their heroes. The streets themselves became makeshift arenas. Graffiti from Pompeii's walls reveals stick-figure combat scenes scratched by childish hands, a crude secutor chasing a fleeing Retiarius, or a triumphant Marcus Vincit. Scrawled beside a victor's pose, even the wealthy weren't immune. Mosaic floors in villas sometimes feature children's footprints frozen in the mortar, proof of impromptu reenactments among the tiled gladiators. Parents might sigh as their offspring turned dinner bread into sword-sliced casualties, but they understood the deeper lesson. These games taught courage, strategy, and the bittersweet truth that even the mightiest warrior could fall. Some children took the fantasy further. Tombstones tell of boys like Lucius, age 10, who begged his father for a real wooden gladius and spent afternoons drilling thrusts and parries with other neighborhood champions. Girls, too, left their mark. Frescoes show them cheering from painted balconies as brothers dueled below, their dolls temporarily forgotten in the thrill of mock combat. The obsession crossed class lines. A slave child's clay figurine found in Ostia was just as carefully crafted as a senator's son's, though perhaps molded from stolen kitchen clay rather than fine artisan's material. The most telling evidence lies in the shadows of the real gladiator schools. Near Rome's Ludus Magnus, archaeologists found child-sized practice swords too small for adults, too precise for mere toys. These were likely used by trainers' sons or young slaves being groomed as future fighters, their play indistinguishable from early training. Even here, though, flashes of childhood peek through. One wooden sword bears teeth marks, as if its owner had chewed the hilt during tense moments, a habit no stern instructor could break. What made gladiators so captivating to young minds? Perhaps it was the spectacle's raw drama, the underdog's triumph, the villain's downfall, all under the gaze of an empire. Or maybe it was the forbidden thrill. Gladiators were both celebrated and scorned, their bloodshed admired but their social status barely above slaves. For Roman children, these fighters embodied a paradox. They were at once the ultimate heroes and cautionary tales. To play at being them was to taste power and peril in equal measure, a lesson no schoolroom scroll could rival. The figurines may be silent now, the graffiti faded, but they still whisper of a time when every child, if only for an afternoon, could be the champion of their own Colosseum. Even the mighty Roman Empire trembled before nature's fury. The ground itself could turn. Traitor earthquakes sent towering temples crashing into dust, while fires raced through cramped apartment blocks like wolves through dry grass. Children who spent their days memorizing Virgil or playing with clay dolls might wake to a world unraveling, where the gods seem to have abandoned them. Pliny the Younger's harrowing account of Pompeii's destruction captures this terror in strokes of ink that still feel wet with panic. He wrote of ash so thick it blotted out the sun, of people tying pillows to their heads as makeshift shields against falling stones, a detail so achingly human it bridges 2 millennia. Imagine a child clutching their bulla amulet as Vesuvius rained fire, their parents' reassurances drowned by the mountain's roar. The archaeology of disaster reveals small, heartbreaking acts of survival. A hollow in the ash at Herculaneum holds the shape of a family huddled together, the mother still cradling an infant. A child's sandal lies mid-stride near Pompeii's gates, its owner forever frozen in flight. Even wealth offered no escape. The mansion of the Menander yielded a silver rattle beside the bones of a toddler who never reached safety. These weren't just victims of geology, they were children who'd played knucklebones in the Forum days before, their laughter now swallowed by time. Rome itself faced constant peril. The Great Fire of 64 AD raged for 6 days, its flames leaping from bakery ovens to mansions with terrifying impartiality. Historians describe children herded into boats on the Tiber, watching helplessly as their neighborhoods burned. Earthquakes regularly shook the city. One particularly violent tremor in the 4th century even toppled the colossal statue of Nero. In a world without seismic warnings or fire brigades, disaster preparedness meant superstition and sacrifice. Families buried foundation offerings beneath their homes, figurines of clutching hands, believed to hold up walls against tremors. Children learned that Vesta's sacred flame wasn't just ritual. If it died, the city stood vulnerable to catastrophe, yet resilience flickered in the darkness. After the fire of 64, Nero rebuilt Rome with wider streets and fire-resistant brick, a lesson in urban planning paid for in ashes. Pliny the Elder perished investigating Vesuvius, but his nephew's meticulous account birthed volcanology. And in the graffiti of Pompeii, amid prayers to Jupiter for protection, we find something remarkable, a crude sketch of a phoenix rising from flames, scrawled by some young hand, not yet broken by fear. These children of disaster left us more than ruins. They left proof that even in the shadow of annihilation, hope could still take root. 2,000 years may separate us from the cobblestone streets of ancient Rome, but the essence of childhood still echoes across the centuries. The wooden swords that Roman boys brandished in mock battles have transformed into plastic lightsabers, yet the impulse to imagine oneself a hero remains unchanged. Today's classrooms may trade wax tablets for touchscreens, but the struggle to focus during long lessons, whether under a grammaticus's stern gaze or a fluorescent-lit modern school, still unites students across time. Even the tension between duty and play persists. Where a Roman child balanced chores like hauling water with racing friends to the Forum, modern kids navigate homework and soccer practice with equal parts enthusiasm and groaning reluctance. Consider education's enduring hierarchies. The Roman elite prized Greek tutors and rhetoric, just as today's privileged families invest in coding camps and Ivy League prep. Meanwhile, vocational training still shapes many children's futures, whether apprenticing in a 1st century blacksmith shop or a 21st century auto repair garage. The tools have evolved, but the divide between theoretical and practical learning echoes through the ages. Even the pressure to perform feels familiar. Where Roman boys recited Virgil for paternal approval, modern students cram for standardized tests under similar familial expectations. Play reveals even deeper parallels. The knucklebones Romans tossed for fortune-telling now manifest as loot boxes in video games, their randomized rewards tapping into the same thrill of chance. Dolls have gone from ivory-jointed figures to plastic fashion icons, yet the narratives children weave around them, practicing caregiving, social roles, even rebellion, remains strikingly consistent. And just as Roman kids etched hopscotch grids into courtyard stones, their modern counterparts chalk identical patterns on sidewalks, their laughter bridging millennia. Yet some contrasts are profound. Roman childhood ended abruptly, a toga virilis ceremony or early marriage catapulting kids into adult responsibilities. Modern adolescence stretches longer, but perhaps with its own challenges. Where Roman children learn trades alongside parents, today's youth often face abstract career paths disconnected from family traditions. The bulla's protective amulets have been replaced by digital tracking apps, both reflecting parental anxiety but through vastly different lenses. The most poignant connection lies in resilience. Roman children navigated plagues and political upheaval. Today's generation faces climate anxiety and global pandemics. Both eras reveal how play becomes both escape and rehearsal, whether building forts from Pompeian rubble or crafting stories in pandemic lockdowns. Toys buried by Vesuvius and action figures left in modern storm cellars whisper the same truth. Childhood adapts, but its core curiosity, creativity, the hunger for belonging, defies time. Perhaps that's the real lesson etched into those ancient wax tablets. The empires rise and fall, but the scribbles of children endure. From dawn prayers at the lararium to moonlit games of knucklebones, the life of a Roman child was a tapestry woven with duty, discipline, and unexpected pockets of joy. They navigated a world where wooden swords prepared them for military service, dolls rehearsed motherhood, and even the simplest meal carried echoes of ancestral tradition. Whether memorizing Virgil under the stern eye of a grammaticus or dodging chores to splash in public fountains, every moment was a lesson, sometimes harsh, often playful, always shaping the next generation of citizens for an empire that demanded both strength and subtlety. The contrasts were as striking as the frescoes on their walls. A patrician's son might debate philosophy 1 hour and lose himself in a backyard gladiator duel the next. A merchant's daughter balanced market calculations with secret whispers over clay dolls, and through it all, the rhythms of festivals, Lupercalia's bloody thongs, Saturnalia's topsy-turvy rules, offered fleeting escapes from the weight of expectation. Even in slavery's grim shadow, children carved out spaces for imagination, their resilience etched in the toys they hid and the friendships they forged against the odds. What lingers most isn't just the structure of their days, but the universal heartbeat beneath, the scraped knees, the stolen sweets, the fierce loyalty to pets and playmates. Rome's children were neither miniature adults nor carefree innocents. They were both, dancing between worlds with a dexterity that still resonates. Their stories remind us that childhood in any era is a mosaic of contradictions, preparation and rebellion, tradition and innovation, tenderness and toughness. So what astonished you about their world? Was it the bulla's protective weight around a boy's neck, or the girl dedicating her doll to Venus on the cusp of marriage? The classrooms where failure meant a switch's sting, or the streets alive with laughter that 2 millennia haven't silenced? Drop your thoughts below and stay tuned, because the journey isn't over. Coming soon, we'll step into the sandals of Roman teens, where togas and coming-of-age rites collide with the dizzying freedoms and fresh pressures of adulthood in the ancient world. The empire's future awaited them, and it's a story you won't want to miss.